The first thing Mark Delaney noticed wasn't the scream. It was the silence after it. Winter in southern Wyoming has a way of swallowing sound. Snow absorbs it. Ice traps it. Even the wind seems to think twice before moving across the open plains outside Saratoga. That morning, the world felt paused until something tore through it. A sharp, echoing crack rolled across the North Platte River Valley, the unmistakable report of ice giving way under weight. Mark looked up from the fence post he'd been repairing. Then came the sound that followed, low, desperate, not a call, a cry. He knew that sound too, and before he could talk himself out of it, he was already walking toward the river. The North Platte curves wide, just west of town, flattening into a broad stretch that looks harmless once it freezes. Snow had covered most of it, smoothing the river into what appeared to be solid ground. But rivers don't stop moving just because the surface freezes. Underneath, the current keeps carving. Mark knew that. Everyone who grows up here does. Still, when he reached the bank and saw the dark shape 50 yards out, his chest tightened. At first glance, it looked like driftwood. Then it moved. An elk cow, massive and pale, against the snow, lay collapsed in the middle of the river bend. Her hindquarters were locked beneath a thick plate of ice. Her front legs scrabbled weakly at the surface, claws scraping uselessly. Steam rose from her flanks in frantic bursts. Her head twisted when she saw him, and the sound she made then, that sound would follow him for weeks. It wasn't loud anymore. It was thin, exhausted. She had already been fighting for hours. Mark stood there longer than he'd ever admit, long enough to imagine walking away, long enough to imagine explaining later. There was nothing I could do. That would have been true, mostly. The ice was unpredictable. The temperature sat at -12 degrees. The nearest wildlife officer was stationed nearly an hour away in Rawlins. Cell service was spotty at best. Everything about the situation said, "Do not step onto that river." He dialed dispatch anyway. He described the location, the condition, the urgency. The officer on the other end was calm. "Sir, we'll send someone, but do not go out there. That ice won't hold a man." Mark stared at the elk. Her head drooped. The officer kept talking. Mark didn't remember what he said in response, only that he ended the call before it was over, because he already knew what he was going to do. He grabbed a tow strap from his truck and looped it around his chest. The other end he secured to the rear hitch. If he fell through, maybe the truck could anchor him. Maybe. The first step onto the river felt wrong. The ice responded with a low, resonant groan that vibrated through his boots and into his bones. He froze. Waited. Another step. The surface held. He spread his weight, moving slowly, knees bent. Every shift felt like a negotiation with something ancient and indifferent beneath him. Halfway out, the elk thrashed again, and the ice answered. A crack splintered outward from her body like a lightning bolt beneath glass. Mark felt it before he heard it. He kept moving, because if he stopped now, fear would win. When he reached her, the scale of the situation became terrifyingly clear. The ice had refrozen around her hind legs overnight, encasing them completely. One foreleg was bent unnaturally, likely fractured when she fell through. Her breathing came in short, violent bursts, but she stopped thrashing long enough for him to examine the ice. It was thick, thicker than he'd hoped. He took out his pocket knife and began chipping. The blade was useless, so he used his boots, his elbows, the butt of the knife, anything. Each strike sent vibrations under the ice sheet. Each strike risked breaking the only thing keeping them both above water. Then it happened. The surface beneath her hips collapsed, and the river swallowed her lower half. When it reached him, it felt like an explosion. There is no easing into river water at negative temperatures. It is not cold. It is violent. The shock ripped the air from his lungs. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might rupture. His muscles seized instantly. For a split second, his brain blanked. That is what kills people in cold water, not hypothermia. Shock. He nearly fell backward. but the elk's head slipped under. Instinct overrode fear. He lunged forward and grabbed the base of her antler. The current surged around them both. Now he was waist deep and losing feeling fast. 30 seconds in freezing water feels like 5 minutes. Your mind splits in two. One part screams, "Get out." The other says, "Not yet." Mark braced his boots against unseen rocks and began breaking the remaining ice with his forearms. Skin split almost immediately. He didn't notice until later. The toe strap behind him snapped tight. The truck shifted slightly. Good. That meant he hadn't been pulled too far downstream. The elk tried to kick. Her broken leg didn't cooperate. He realized something then. If he didn't free her completely, the current would twist her body sideways and drown her, or worse, trap her under the remaining ice. He plunged both arms into the freezing water and tore at the jagged edge beneath her hips. That's when the ice sheet collapsed entirely, and both of them went under. The world disappeared. Sound vanished. Light fractured into gray streaks. He couldn't tell which direction was up. The cold was no longer sharp. It was numb, immediate, paralyzing. He felt the strap yank hard against his ribs. For one horrifying second, he imagined it snapping. He thought of his daughter, he thought. Then the strap pulled tight. Violently, it dragged him backward. His head broke the surface in a spray of shattered ice and black water. He gasped so hard it felt like swallowing knives. And somehow, he still had hold of the elk. Two snowmobilers had been riding along the far bank and saw the truck fishtail when the strap went tight. They raced over. One jumped off before the machine stopped moving. He ran straight to the truck and slammed it into drive to maintain tension. The other crawled toward the river with another rope. By then, Mark's movements were slowing. His speech, when he tried to shout instructions, came out slurred. Classic early hypothermia. The second rope looped around the elk's chest. Between engine torque and 3 men pulling with everything they had left, they dragged her toward thicker ice near shore. Mark collapsed before he felt solid ground beneath him. He didn't remember the wildlife officer arriving, didn't remember the ambulance, didn't remember being wrapped in thermal blankets inside the back of the truck. He remembered warmth returning to his fingers like 1,000 needles stabbing inward. He remembered someone saying, "Stay with us." He remembered thinking he was embarrassed for needing help. The elk, meanwhile, was sedated and transported to a rehabilitation facility near Laramie. Her leg required surgery. The prognosis was uncertain. Doctors later explained how close it had been. Core temperature had dropped rapidly. Another 5 minutes submerged and he likely would have lost consciousness. Another 10, cardiac arrest. The frightening part, near the end, he said he didn't feel cold anymore. He felt calm, almost warm. That false comfort is how hypothermia kills. It convinces you everything is fine, right before it isn't. News travels fast in places like Saratoga. Some called him a hero. Some called him reckless. At the cafe on Bridge Street, conversations split down the middle. It's wildlife. That's nature. He's lucky to be alive. But the people who had heard that scream understood something different. They understood that sometimes it isn't about outcome, it's about refusal. Refusal to watch suffering and do nothing. Refusal to let something die alone 50 yards from your boots. Spring came slowly. Snow retreated in patches. The river thawed, running high and brown with meltwater from the snowy range. Mark's hands healed, though 2 fingers remained sensitive to cold. He didn't talk about that morning much, until he received a call. The elk had survived, against expectation. The leg healed well enough for release into protected foothills. He didn't attend. He said it wasn't necessary. But that evening, he drove out to the river bend anyway. The ice was gone. The water moved freely again, as if nothing had happened. That's the unsettling thing about nature. It doesn't memorialize events. It just continues. People still ask him, was it worth it? He doesn't answer quickly, because the honest answer isn't simple. He knows the statistics. He knows how close he came. He knows his daughter could have grown up with a story instead of a father, but he also knows this. When he looked into that animal's eyes, there was no audience, no cameras, no praise waiting on the other side, just a choice. And sometimes the measure of who you are is decided in seconds no one else sees. The North Platte will freeze again next winter. It always does. Snow will smooth over the river bend. It will look safe. It will lie. But somewhere in the Wyoming foothills, an elk walks on 4 strong legs, and in a quiet house in Saratoga, there's a man who knows exactly how cold that water is, because he felt it trying to take him, and he stepped forward anyway.